Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Voice of Authority webinar brought to you today by Willmott Dixon. My name's Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director at 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. And since 2004, we've been running over 30 events a year, bringing councils and the development community together. During lockdown, we've been doing that by organising webinars, which are now taking place twice, even 3 times a week. At one of those sessions recently, you may recall we discussed how councils can help make development healthy. And we were contacted after that by a company called Cllr that's keen to upgrade and improve sports pitches and recreation grounds and local parks and golf courses to encourage more people to use them. They say they can do that at no cost to councils, and they're doing it in Harrow and they're doing it in Barking and Dagenham. We're going to send out a link to their website following this session so you can judge for yourselves. And that's a shameless plug, but I hope it indicates that our aim here is to make a difference. We're not here to provide just another talking shop. Our mission at 3Fox is to keep our network connected so that you can get things done. And to that end, we'll be back at this time next Thursday to look at a case study of successful collaboration between 11 county district and borough councils and a LEP, in which we played a small but I hope useful part to create the Hertfordshire Growth Board. If we're lucky and the stars align, we're going to have a special guest joining us here later today to tell you about the launch of that board next week. If you've got any interest in development in Hertfordshire or in how councils can successfully work together, I recommend you stay to the end at midday to hear what she's got to say. But between now and then, we've got another fascinating discussion lined up for you. How can the UK be the world leader for sustainable buildings after Covid-19? Sustainable buildings provide an opportunity for places to be built to perform better, to meet the needs of their users, and to help the environment. But what can sustainable development realistically contribute to the green agenda and public health post-coronavirus? Is it practical for all future buildings to be Passivhaus, for example? Does sustainability mean the same thing for all types of building? Should there be a push to retrofit buildings that can gain from having sustainable elements? And what can central government do to help the sustainable buildings agenda? What else needs to be done more generally to encourage more sustainable building? We've been working with Willmott Dixon to bring together a terrific panel to put these questions to over the next half an hour. And after that, it's over to you, our viewers. We're hoping that the next 30 minutes of conversation will prompt or even inspire you into using the Q&A function on the bottom of your screens to set questions and to vote for them so that we can put the most popular questions to the panel. Any questions that aren't answered live will follow up with panelists, and their responses will be circulated across social media channels to keep the conversation going. We'll be screening some snap polls during this session, mostly simple yes or no questions for you to complete and to help feed the discussion and the report that will follow this session. So can our panelists stir you into action? What do Kingston, Sutton and Crawley have to offer in a discussion about world leadership in sustainable buildings? What are they so proud of? I'm very much looking forward to finding out from, in alphabetical order, Cllr Emily Davey, portfolio holder for housing in Kingston, Cllr Peter Lamb, the leader of Crawley Borough Council, and Cllr Jayne McCoy, deputy leader at Sutton Council. And our sponsor today, representing the whole of the private sector, Roger Forsdyke, Managing Director, London and South at Willmott Dixon, who's bearing the load very lightly. Turning to you first, Cllr Lamb at Crawley, what's the borough doing to work towards creating a greater amount of sustainable homes? And how important is it for local authorities to have sustainable buildings, sustainable public buildings?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on today. I think that the reality is that had COVID not struck, this would be a much bigger topic of conversation today than it's become, because going into COVID, the whole climate change emergency agenda have really taken the fore. And on our part, at least, I can certainly say it triggered a lot of work around asking ourselves questions about just what the levels of emissions are locally and what can be done about it. And you start to see just how high the level of emissions remain from people's housing, that after a generation of attempts to get people to put in, higher levels of stuff in the lofts and, improving with double glazing and such to their own properties, they still remain incredibly heat inefficient buildings. Our own attempts are largely focused around building new buildings. It's having high standards in our local plan to ensure that people have to build decent levels of installation into housing. Greater requirements around things like solar and PV, particularly on our own homes. We have a requirement around district heat networks that everything's got to be able to be connected in, and the council is working to bring those forward, particularly in the town centre developments at the moment where we're building the plant ourselves. And when it comes to the council's own stock, we've really focused on passive housing to a large extent. It's not perfect, it has its issues, it is more expensive, and it does have problems with damp, but it significantly improves that quality of installation, and certainly the residents appreciate the lower costs. The bigger problem ultimately is going to be around refurbishment, and we know this because it's easier to do something at the time than it is to go back and refurb things. And we have a potential advantage there in Crawley in that as a new town, so much of our housing is built to very similar levels of standards, so you can sort of imagine a factory style process going in and refurbing a lot of those buildings, but it comes at a very high cost. Now we're talking with other people within our local area. We're part of the Greater Brighton Economic Board, and I think if you're going to do this, it has to be done at scale, which means talking to your neighbours. But there's a very big price here in terms of tackling the climate emergency. It's clearly a political issue. It's certainly a life and death issue for the planet, and in terms of meeting our own carbon reduction targets, you can even offset what you're doing as a local authority against what you save on the housing. And there are councils who are claiming to be carbon neutral, and the only reason they've managed to do that is through claiming that offsetting. Certainly there's big advantages in terms of developing skills and the potential jobs that comes out of it, particularly if you're an early supplier. But let's not ignore just how big the challenges are. The skills don't exist yet. The conversations are it's going to take 10 years to learn how to refurb housing. We haven't got those 10 years. We know that when it comes down to a lot of authorities, they haven't got their own stock, which makes them very vulnerable. We're lucky that we do. We have almost a quarter of our housing in the town is either Crawley Borough Council or a housing association. But the big problem for us, like a lot of people, is that when just trying to get a roof over someone's head in the first place, it's got to be your priority. Trying to find the money out of your housing revenue account on top of that for a massive programme of refurbishment is incredibly challenging. What would be ideal is if we could have something like in countries overseas where you could increase rent or have a separate charge on top of those units that you refurb, less than the saving that they're making on that energy cost. So residents still end up better off, but through that programme you could fund one heck of a lot more improvements, and housing associations are in a position where they can do that. Local authorities at this point are not, and that's deeply hampering attempts to finance programmes to improve the quality of housing. And unless we deal with existing housing, we're simply not going to win this fight.
Do you expect much of a contribution to come from the sort of government handouts that have been announced recently in terms of improving sustainability?
What you usually find with any handout from government, we're particularly finding this when it comes down to the COVID money, is you get about a sixth of what you need. Usually it's coming out of money that they've already technically given you, so no.
Yeah. Okay, Councillor McCoy at Sutton, my own borough, and I'm less than a mile away from Passivhaus School, the Harris Academy that you've built with Willmott Dixon. Can you tell us a little bit about what makes that particular scheme unique and how it raises the stakes in terms of what can be built in Sutton and elsewhere?
Oh, hi. Thank you. Welcome to everyone. Well, our approach in Sutton has always been to lead by example, because how can we ask developers to deliver highly sustainable buildings if we're not prepared to invest in them ourselves? And the Harris Academy in Sutton is unique because it's the UK's first Passivhaus secondary school. So delivering this school, we're demonstrating a commitment to the very highest standards of energy efficiency. And we're also in the process of delivering our first Passivhaus primary school in the borough, in Hackbridge. Now, prior to the Harris Academy, the last school we built in Sutton, Stanley Park, achieved very high sustainability for the time, but we've pushed beyond that to deliver buildings with even lower energy usage. We've set ourselves out to be a sustainable borough, and that means ensuring that we reduce our impact on the planet in every way we can. So we've intentionally set the bar high. But these new schools have had to be new build because we've expanded all of our existing schools as far as they could go. And as Passivhaus schools, we think they represent a double investment in our future. by demonstrating careful management of the Earth's resources and investing in future generations by providing them with healthier environments to learn in. So we think these two exemplar buildings put us in a good place to demand high sustainability from all our new development in the borough, and that's all incorporated in our planning policies. And we've also applied the same principle to our house building. Our new build council house developments deliver not just high quality accommodation, but are built to high sustainability standards that will help reduce heating costs and provide a better quality living environment. Now, you've asked, should all new buildings be sustainable? And frankly, if we're serious about tackling climate change, then that's got to be a given. And I think you also asked, can all new buildings be Passivhaus? Well, going back to the title of this webinar, if we want the UK to be a world leader in sustainable development, then that's a necessity. Because the number of buildings in the UK achieving Passivhaus standards is only around about 263, and that's well below the totals in most other European countries. So we need to think about why that is. Is our regulatory framework focusing on the wrong targets? Or are our architects being trained in the technology underlying Passivhaus standards? Or is that something that we need to look at? But if we're going to be true world leaders in sustainability, I think the priority needs to be firmly on retrofitting, as Councillor Lamb highlighted, because our housing stock is the least energy efficient in Europe. But improving the installation is actually a quick and cost-effective way to reduce carbon emissions. And it could also really help generate jobs if it's done at scale. So whilst we focus on the sustainability of new build, we're forgetting that the majority of our building stock already exists. And this presents a vast new industry opportunity. So in Sutton, we're again trying to lead by example, and our housing stock is going to be benefiting from a new energy sprung project, which super insulates some of our more complex older stock, installing heat pumps, solar panels, mechanical ventilation with heat recovery in a whole house retrofit of about 100 residential properties. And at the moment, that's a novel project, one of only 2 in the UK, I believe. But we hope that by our example, we're going to see it become mainstream.
You take some really brave steps there, Councillor McCoy. But I assume you would echo Councillor Lamb's point that that the funding that's been recently announced, it's you know, it's a great direction of travel, but it's not enough. It's not enough.
I mean, councils have been quite good at sort of finding different ways of obtaining, you know, pots of funding here and there to make things happen. I think we were awarded the Energy Strong project, but it is hit or miss. It is whoever can make the best case and whoever's got the time to make the case. We certainly need more investment to help us do this.
Fantastic. So we got Councillor Davey. We've got two councils so far really committed to sustainable buildings, to investing in innovative approaches and trying to find the funding to retrofit and to ensure that new buildings are sustainable. But we've got some issues around, you know, is there a regulatory problem? Do we need a different kind of training regime for young architects so that these elements become more widespread? And clearly, as always, you know, funding is a major issue. We want to hear from you about the Cambridge Road estate in Kingston especially, but if you'd like to address any of those issues as well, we'd welcome your thoughts.
Yes, well, perhaps I should introduce the Cambridge Road estate. It's 865 homes, and I don't know if you ever watched The Bill, but it was filmed there. If you think about tower blocks and deck access, built in the 60s, 70s, real concrete, and there's hot air heating, you know, hot air vents heating the place. Very few radiators have been fitted anywhere, and there's no insulation. And we had a ballot earlier this year, and with an 86% turnout, 73% said yes to redeveloping the whole place. So it's a fantastic project we've got going on. We're going to put on 2,170 new homes, and we'll be retaining all the council homes, and anybody from the council, any council tenant who wants to stay can stay, and we're adding to that. So we'll end up with 767 minimum of council rent properties. So we've got, it's in phases. And what we've got to look at is the sustainability across. It's not just the energy sustainability, we're looking at the heating, the water, building design, the ecology. As you can imagine, the ecology, the diversity on a concrete, its variations on what can grow on concrete. We have got some mature trees, but we've got a lot of concrete. So looking at the energy source, and I'll come back to it at the end, because that's really going to change the way we look at energy in Kingston, if we can get it, is what we've got is a pioneering approach of using the heat from the sewage works. And I'll come back to that. Then over the next, there was the heating, cooling. We've got it again, a centralised energy centre. We're harvesting rainwater, things that we've heard about a lot, things like sustainable urban stuff, more insulation. Just by putting in insulation, we can cut the energy consumption by 60%. It's 60% just by actually being able to insulate people's homes, giving them heating controls, solar PV, so we're going to be cutting down the service charge for tenants in the communal areas because we'll be able to have that cross-funded. Looking at biodiversity, trying to get new trees planted, more trees, there'll be over 100 more trees planted. Also looking at bat boxes, bird boxes, stag beetles, actually trying to bring wildlife. We've got a bit of wildlife on the estate, we need to bring in more. Also looking about the transport at the moment, because there's so many stairs on the estate, to get from A to B, wheelchair users have to go all the way around the outside. If you are trying to ride a bicycle, you wouldn't. You just don't ride a bicycle on that estate. You can't, you wouldn't actually, there's no place to lock your bicycle. But also, you're going to get home, you have to carry your bicycle up all these stairs because it's being built against the grain of the land. And then, so we're going to be making it, there's a layout that encourages cycling, walking, fits in with our Go Cycle routes, electric car charging, and also thinking about the residents, the community, the social impact of actually having some community. We've got very limited community facilities, that's what we'll have. Also thinking about their health to enable them to actually enjoy the outdoors more. We've got a few play areas, but we wanted to increase the number of outdoor areas. And then also what I'm particularly interested in is the economic sustainability of those living in the properties. That if by designing it around a courtyard design, the hope is that we can then enable people to work from home and look after their children, but also think about, we'll get more of these informal childcare arrangements so that in fact we can increase, I'm going to be sexist, women's earning capacity, because often when you look at the number of tenants in the state, it tends to be, households tend to be headed by women and their ability to work. And that we've seen under COVID, we need to enable people to work from home, but also we've got to enable people to have informal, cheaper childcare. And by having it around courtyards, this is hoped. But going back to the very beginning when I mentioned about the sewage to power, and where's that to start? So we've got in this estate, major transformation is going to be happening. But how are we going to power it? Down the road, not that far from the estate, is the sewage works, Thames Water Sewage Works for about southwest London. So we've got Sutton sewage and we've got Croydon sewage. And what happens is there's a lot of heat it generates. And the moment they're having to cool it down and then put it into the hogs mill, and even then it's too hot for the hogs mill, and it's affecting the biodiversity in the hogs mill. So what we're suggesting is, we've been investigating and working out, is extracting that heat from the hogs mill and then using it, not only to heat this estate. We've also got the hospital interested. We're building a new school. It will also be heated with this. Our small sites nearby are going to be heated by it. There's the town centre, the potential to be able to heat a swimming pool from that. Also the potential to retrofit Kingston town centre, because the amount of power that is produced by southwest London's sewage is incredible. So what we're looking at is, not only are we talking about something being zero carbon heating and continuous, so it's not this stop, it's not like wind energy or anything like that, it's continuous, but also it will generate an income for us too, because we'll be selling the energy. The next stage of it, when you talk about government funding and government grants, is to try and get the government to help us with the capital investment. If we can get that next stage in, then we've done all the research. We can see the figures stack up. We can see how much power we can get. If we can get to that point to help us create that network, then we are really going places. Because if we can get those in, we've now got the estate, we get the hospital, we get the school, we get the small site, then you're really going and motoring. And yes, you could find Kingston with yes, powered on sewage.
Excellent. What an image. I don't know whether to be proud of Sutton's sewage being as powerful as it is, or insisting that it's surely the cleanest and least of the contributors of those three boroughs to your power in typically English sort of reserved fashion about these things. But thank you very much, Emily. That's a fantastic picture of perhaps the future for all estate developments. Roger, this must be sort of music to your ears. So councils are leading the way in innovating around sustainability and sustainable buildings. And I've spoken to you a few times now and got a sense of how passionate you are about this theme. What can you tell us about how typical these approaches are in London and the South, the region that you cover, and perhaps what the private sector, what developers and contractors can do to encourage an increase in this sort of behaviour and approach?
I think, thank you, Toby, and thank you, everyone. I think what's interesting about this is the intent is there for everyone, but I think there's some real barriers in practical terms. And they've been mentioned, a few of them, not least of which general skill sets. Retrofit is important to me, but more important, I suppose, is not to continuously build buildings that meet a minimum standard only of building regs and don't meet a sort of low carbon agenda. And so I was delighted when Sutton commissioned a Passivhaus job, and I've got to say, just to get some context to this, one of the reasons Passivhaus is seen as expensive in new build is just a risk profile of the unknown. And I think I want to say today that I don't believe that's a truth. Our experience at Sutton and also Hackbridge, which is what we built for the borough, is that actually they're pretty much cost neutral because they're not complex buildings, but they are highly insulated, as you've already said. So whatever you've got additional costs with some of the insulation and the wall and the envelope development, but then you save all of that on the non-complex M&E systems. So for new builds, I think the barriers aren't as financial as people maybe think. As a managing director of a local business, I look at Passivhaus now as something that I want to promote, not something that is high risk at all. And yet in the past, I might have looked at it as that because it was unusual and unknown, and as such attracted more risk. But I think we've got to see there's a real belief in councils and the general population, if they have a choice, there's cost neutral, something that has 80% less expenditure on bills, 50% less expenditure on FM. These buildings are highly, they're very quality buildings because to assess the Passivhaus, you have to build them very precisely, which gives you an inherent quality. But the actual mechanisms that go into it are no more expensive, I believe, and that's really what I think. So what are the barriers to people and what are the perceptions to say, well, why wouldn't I have a low carbon building if that's true, Roger? And I think what happens is exactly as Jane said, maybe there's some architectural lack of technical expertise. You commission an architect, perhaps they would say, well, you can't afford a Passivhaus, I'll give you this, and do some low carbon stuff, but not all the way, if you like. And I think for me, it's about upskilling and making sure you're working with and commissioning architects that understand the systems that they're, as you did with Archetype at Sutton, and then work with contractors that don't add risk to the process because it's unknown to them. I'm very, very keen to promote this because I think, as all of the people have said on this webinar, it's something we should be doing, something we are doing, but not just doing it nearly enough. I mean, if public sector want to do it, but private sector also want to do it, but they feel that it is too difficult or too capital cost expensive, and maybe the capex and the user costs are not connected. But if, as I said, is right, that I can build them for the same money as a DFE school for Sutton, then why wouldn't you? There isn't a barrier, is there? It's just a route to market, I suppose. And often as a contractor, we come to that a bit too late. We get the phone call after the architect's commissioned, after the design and some of the planning's been done. And that hasn't really been done with this in mind on many, many occasions. So I think it is happening slowly. And I really do commend Sutton and Jane for the leadership they've shown, because I think she's absolutely right. You know, local authorities have to say, you know, this is what we believe in, this is what we're going to commission, and then we can demonstrate the density in the market to actually do all our buildings like this. I would certainly welcome an increase in building regs to demand. And they are getting there, but you know, we have to do this as far as I'm concerned. You know, the argument's over, and not only from a sustainable and moral ground, but purely from your economics. You know, if you can build the same thing and pay a lot less to run it, who doesn't want it? I mean, I've got to say that we should be pushing at an open door for my money. So it's who do you commission, and how do you commission your works is probably the big question for me.
Yeah, as I understand it, Roger, the government now insists on these standards for any building on government land or as part of government projects. So I guess I'd be interested in the panel's views on whether this should just be straightforward regulation. You know, is it as simple as just creating laws that say that buildings have to reach certain sustainability limits, or they don't get built? But just before we spin back to the panel and ask that question among others, Julia Barrett in the audience has raised her hand, and I have to say I'm very sorry, but I operate these webinars in a rather autocratic manner, and we don't ask other people to join the platform. This is the councillors and Roger's platform to speak, but we do welcome your questions, and if you would put them through the Q&A channel, we will get to them. There are a few there already that we'll come to in a minute. Just before we do though, Roger, can you talk a little bit perhaps about your experience elsewhere in London and the South? Are there any other schemes that we should all be aware of in terms of sustainability?
No, listen, not as stand out in my experience as our experience at Sutton. I'm very keen to commission it. We're working now in our central departments to create some more standardised designs that might fit certain you know, homes, if you want to commission homes, if you want to commission schools, with Passivhaus mandate. So a lot of the pre-design's done, and that will hopefully make the cost of commission less as well. Because if you've got elements largely pre-designed for some of these things, then you can obviously reduce your cost of design as well as hopefully maintain a similar cost for your build. So that's what we're trying to promote. But I guess, as I said before, our point of sale sometimes comes a bit late to this. And under a lot of frameworks, the design's already, you know, some of the feasibility is already done without this in mind. So it's very difficult then to transpose, you know, more standardised elements or more Passivhaus elements onto something that's already been commissioned.
Fantastic, thanks Roger. Councillor Lamb, if you'd like to pick up on any of these threads, please feel free to do so. But also, we've got a question from Kemi Away. I hope I pronounced that right, Kemi. What measures are you taking to educate your communities on the benefits of sustainability and take them on the journey and develop a sustainable community, young and old?
Well, we're not an education authority, so we're quite limited in terms of our ability to actually engage directly on these issues. To be honest, not a lot at the moment. The majority of this sort of conversation is taking place at the national level, and people, I think, are alive to that. The real problem, which I see coming down the road, is it's very easy for people to sign a petition, you know, in support of a climate change emergency and to say something needs to happen. When they start running into the real implications of that in terms of things that they might need to spend or do or not do, I see big problems running into that, because we have yet to have that difficult conversation, I think, as a community, which is to say that ultimately sustainability requires us to do less of what we've become accustomed to. And as a community where we've got aviation as the largest part of our economy, we're very conscious that, you know, there is no way of getting through this without hardship. Now, in terms of a domestic level, that's a lot more, you know, in terms of tackling house prices and so in terms of tackling home improvements and things such as that, it's a lot easier to tackle because it doesn't really come at that significant cost necessarily to them. But it's one of a whole range of conversations, frankly, that we need to take place about sustainability.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the joys of doing webinars all through lockdown has been hearing the background noises in people's houses and birds singing and Amazon deliveries arriving and so on. And I believe we've got a cat today, which is excellent. It just makes these things different.
Trying to avoid him walking across the screen.
We'd like to see him. Don't worry about it. But okay, so it's a difficult conversation for a community, and it sounds like. It's one of those conversations like the social care conversation where we've got some big decisions to make and everybody agrees on the outcomes that we want, but nobody's quite looking at the elephant in the room of just how much we've got to pay. Councillor Davey, would you agree with that? Is that a difficult conversation for your communities?
No, I mean, when I think of the Cambridge Road estate, I've just seen a question come in the box. We're not talking biogas. I should quickly say that it's not biogas heating things. It is extraction of heat. But actually the education or the ideas, because for that ballot, we had to do a lot of workshops and residents were involved in those. And we had hundreds of residents involved. So they actually meant that we had to discuss things and have listen to people because you can hear people's concerns. If you look at, I happen to be a housing lawyer as well, a housing solicitor, you look at all English housing cases and I can assure you it is all damp and cold. That is all the cases. When it comes down to disrepair, it's variations of damp and cold. So when you're talking to residents about changing their heating systems, saving energy and things, what's going through their mind is, how am I going to dry my clothes? What's my energy bill going to be? You know, I don't have a drying area. I don't want to pay for a dryer. How am I going to do this? So actually having that discussion meant that we could, because we were in workshops and bringing up those issues, that a lot of that, I don't know whether we call it education, it was answering people's concerns and also meeting them where they're at and recognizing. And I had, saying to, working with Countryside and their architect saying, we have to ensure that the people who live in those properties can afford to live in them. That means that they don't have to rely on dryers, tumble dryers. And they're not going to have the housing officer come round and telling them to stop drying clothes on their radiators and stop drying their clothes inside because there's nowhere else for them to dry them. So do you see how it's actually about meeting people where they're at and having a dialogue? And that's what the ballot has given us, that dialogue. I wanted to pick up on some of the other things where you were talking about private regulation and dealing with things. If you think about, it makes sense for us as a social landlord to build sustainable properties. If you think in the private sector, it may not make so much sense. So you need that regulation, because if you're just building to sell, it's not you that has to live there. And you can certainly see this if you look at the private rented sector. And that is the highest area for fuel poverty. And really, we've got the tiniest amount of regulation that's only come in a little bit earlier this year over enabling, saying that what level at which a private landlord can let out a property. Because it's the private landlord doesn't pay the energy bills, doesn't have to deal with the draft be placed. There's nothing in it for private landlords to actually insulate and make their homes more environmentally sustainable. And then equally, there is nothing in it really for the private developer to do that. Do you remember back when you think about it? You know, nowadays when you go shopping for fridges and freezers, there's that energy efficiency thing for that. That EHCP is supposed to be doing that for you when you purchase, but that comes pretty low on the agenda when you're going house hunting. How many people actually choose their property based on the EHCP? They'll probably choose, if they're in our boroughs, where the schools are, okay, what the schools are like. That's what's dictating them. It's not the ECP certificate. So that we've got actually, the only way we're going to deal with the private sector and private sector new build is through regulation. I can't see another way of actually incentivizing the private sector, because it's not them that live in it.
Councillor McCoy, Sutton makes great claims about its sort of green credentials and advertises the borough as such. How have you, I was part of the conversation around the Harris Academy and hugely supportive. I've got a friend who's got a child there and is extremely proud of that, but neither of us are suffering any parking issues as a result of the school being built. I wonder how difficult these conversations are in Sutton from your experience and what the borough is doing to get that conversation going so that a house buyer will look for that sustainability stamp and be proud to be buying into it.
I think in Sutton we are lucky because our residents already get the green agenda. They chase us. They ask us. They say, "Are you doing enough?" You know, you make these claims. You say you're green. Are you doing enough? So we're pushed. So they're actually quite easy conversations to have, and that's been around for a long time. I think that's why we, you know, I don't know how it was before my time when we first got there, but we've had this. I think we've put the green agenda at the front, so we've been talking about it for a very long time, and now people have come to expect it from us. So we feel we're responding to our residents in, you know, seeking new and innovative ways of delivering that. So we're pushing. As we, you know, we've been doing lots of innovative things, but as we get down to the you know, more important things, or not more important things, but the trickier issues, then I think the conversations are going to get harder. Because, you know, to deliver the kind of change that is necessary for us to be world leaders, or just to, you know, to manage climate change, the conversations are going to get harder. I think, you know, there is a recognition across the country, across the world, these things need to be done. But when it comes down to what you as an individual need to do and need to change, so, you know, we can keep pushing, we can keep getting the message out, and we can lead by example. And showing that things are easy, showing that it's you know, ways to be. There are ways of doing this. You know, really good to hear Roger say that actually Passivhaus is not more difficult and it's not more expensive. I think these are the messages that need to get out. So it's about talking a lot about these things and being clear about these things.
Roger, can you foresee a time when Willmott Dixon is refusing to take on a scheme unless you're allowed to build to Passivhaus standards?
I would love to get to that point when the market allows us to do that. I think one of the key points that we offer all our customers is a route to zero carbon. I think you have to, for this, it's about who actually has the experience to help you in your mission. And there are architects out there, but very few contractors that probably have the actual knowledge or the ambition, quite frankly, to push this agenda. It's part of our DNA. We've been carbon neutral for 7 years. From my point of view, if you're not sustainable, then what are you doing in the market? I think what it's important for us is to find more and more partners that want to share that ambition, and it has to happen right at the very beginning when you're looking at your land, whether you're a private developer or a public developer. But I take Emily's point. I think with private developers, I think they're less driven for it because it is purely the capital cost and they don't have the ongoing cost of bills, etc. So I think Emily makes a really good point. But I think from our view, we're a private business, and I think we are driven by values, and we would much prefer to build all of our buildings to carbon neutral standards, and that's really where we're driving for, and we want partners to do that with, and our expertise has been driven to do that. So I think that's one of the key points, that part of this is an expertise lacking in the general built community.
Fair enough, Roger. I'm fascinated to see that 4% of our audience today does not think that the UK should require Passivhaus standards. I'd be really interested if you could, through the Q&A function, let us know why you feel that way. But in the meantime, Roger earlier sort of issued threw down a gauntlet to architects, really, and that's the nature of these conversations, isn't it? If there isn't an architect present in the conversation, then that's where the sort of scapegoat is. But Rachel Shaw from Architecture PLB is written in to say that they specialise in this. They've got in-house certified Passivhaus designers, and they say that Rachel is saying that the skills are available in the profession, but we need to find ways of matching the right architectural practices with local authorities to help realise the climate emergency ambitions. So I'm going to bounce that back to Jane, because you selected Archetype, didn't you? Did you go out and seek exclusively someone who could build to that sustainability standard?
I think there was, we had an ambition, and so we looked for people who could work with us and achieve that ambition. I think we're lucky we've got officers and that who have got good knowledge of that market and that area. So you know, looking and believe, it's just that having a belief that it's possible, a desire to do that, and we're really grateful that we're able to deliver that. I would just flag up, I mean, we're building schools to Passivhaus standard. One of the issues we've got is we've got another school that's being built that is being delivered by the DFA. We've got no say in that whatsoever, and we're actually very disappointed at the design standards that they put forward. But that's completely out of our hands, because as a planning authority, we can only react to what's put forward. So I think that is quite difficult. Yeah, but then as I say, finding the right partners is important.
Councillor Davey, did you? I mean, have you got sort of frameworks set up that seek out specifically against sustainability expertise?
I'm afraid, because I don't do the development side of things, and that aspect, I do less of that. But I know for when we were going out to tender for the Cambridge Road estate, it was one of those items that actually, when there was a change of administration, that we wrote in higher levels of environmental sustainability that we wanted, and as I mentioned before, economic sustainability for the people living in the properties, so that there is that. As for us being able to retrofit and our stock and that side of things, we're at a very low base, because it's about money. It's about how much money you get from the central government to do this, and we're not an ARMO, we're not a housing association. We've got what we can get in from our rent, through our rent, so we're not able to do as much as we want to. However, you know, there is certainly the ambition is there to improve things, and the new builds that we are building are to a higher standard, much higher standard.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Councillor Lamb, we're back where we started with you. You raised the point, didn't you, that it all comes down to money. And our most popular question that the viewers are voting for spins us back to that as well. Sarah McKinnell put it, what are the panel's views on the Chancellor's announcements of the £3 billion package of green investment? My guess is a degree of scepticism. Would I be right?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, our general experience in the past has tended to be that announcements are made, and when you pour through the detail, it's not as reported. But you know, I shouldn't be too negative. It's a step in the right direction. It's a positive step in the right direction, and at least shows that it's on the radar. But it can't be the final step. It's not going to be remotely enough to tackle what we're going to have to tackle over the next few years. You know, and certainly when you look at a lot of the conditions, I'd imagine it's not going to be hugely helpful. My general impression is it's going to be up to local authorities to find a way forward for themselves. And as I said earlier, there are ways of doing this that just require regulatory changes, you know, particularly in terms of the ways in which we raise money on the housing revenue account. That would make it quite easy for us to do it. And the most frustrating thing is that, you know, the constant argument is, you know, we can build more housing by lowering the conditions that are placed on developers, as opposed to, okay, the system's not great. How do we improve the system so that the needs of the community and the needs of developers are met through it? It's a very blunt tool that's used, and bearing in mind that it's consistently been used over the last 10 years, and we are no better off than we were 10 years ago. Maybe it's time for a different approach.
Yeah, no, fair point. So we've got a question in now, or a point being raised, Councillor Lamb, about the planning process, the timing at which a Passivhaus specialist architect might be involved in a scheme. So Oliver Mowry, old friend from Montague Evans, is asking how councils are committed to securing planning themselves quite often prior to tendering for partners and contractors, which then has a sort of knock-on effect of inflating costs when seeking Passivhaus. So at the moment, these two issues are colliding on a number of schemes. Do councillors on the panel sense any recognition of this at a political level, that planning, design and procurement process on public land might need to be rethought?
Well, I mean, in terms of our own projects, it's all been design and build contracts. So, you know, the planning process has come later. In terms of that, I'll be honest, I'm not an expert in this. You know, this is not my day job. My day job is working with councils largely on public consultations or with the NHS. So I do have some expertise around that. But the actual detail of getting some forward, you know, we rely on officers for advice, and they will play it safe 90% of the time. If we are provided with information that enables us to confidently go to officers and say, actually, I'm not convinced it's the best approach, can we look into others? That's how you move the conversation forward. But a lot of the time, the lobbying is not really done of members to try and address these things. It's done very, like I say, at national level. It's a very blunt tool, as opposed to just coming and having that conversation, saying, okay, how do we find, you know, a better way forward all round? And I have had that in other areas of the council, most recently around insurance, where, you know, you're tackling a very conservative approach by local authorities. Local authorities, by tradition, are risk averse. You know, they don't want any risk at all, and they'll minimise that as far as possible, to the extent of costing themselves millions of pounds extra in terms of some things because they haven't tackled them right. You've got to have that information because we're amateurs at the end of the day, and you know the officers are going to play it safe by and large because their jobs depend on it.
Yeah, that's an absolutely fair response. Roger, again, you've spoken passionately about how we should be looking at all different kinds of buildings in terms of sustainability and passive house specifically. This isn't just about housing, is it? It's not just about schools. How far should we be spreading these approaches?
As far as I'm concerned, I think the standards that Passive House generate across the whole spectrum of construction, whether you're doing an archive store or whether you're doing a new sports centre, this is all about making, and let's face it, where did Passive House start? It started about creating really nice environments for people to live and work in. And to take Emily's point, a lot of stock is just not that. It's drafty, cold, damp, etc., etc. So for me, it's a starting point of, do you actually want a nice building to be in and actually enjoy the space and the environment you create? Well, that's a good place to start. And then do you want to pay 80% less for it? Yeah, when you're actually trying to run the thing, well, it's a bit of a no-brainer to me. And quite frankly, to help people that are on this call and listening to this, I think that quite often, we have the capacity in our organisation to help you on this journey. And I think, you're talking about risk averse, and I think that's absolutely right. But often, working with a contractor like us, you will get those risks, basically resolved, and actually get to. I was interested in what you said, Jane, about the DFE making it almost impossible. The DFE rates are not that. Are challenging, but I believe we can get to a passive house solution even at the DFE rates, and that's why I am sending out a challenge there about this idea that somehow it's more expensive, because my experience is that it's just a very good quality build, which takes a high degree of ensuring that you're building it as spec. And an awful lot of what we've built in the built environment for the last 30, 40 years doesn't even build to its design parameters. It doesn't even perform to its design parameters. You've got a massive gap between how they were designed as regards fuel use in use and to what they actually cost end users. So I don't think we've got a big performance gap in what's currently being built. And so for me, I think, to answer your question directly, every single sector should be looking for these principles to build to, and they need people to support them to do it. And that's really why we've sponsored this webinar, because we're passionate about it.
Councillor Lamb, you mentioned the NHS earlier. What's their sort of receptiveness to sustainability in design and development?
I mean, to be honest, that's not really the bits of it that I work with, but I can tell you that in terms of dealing with the NHS, we talk about it as if it's a single organisation, and it's not. It's thousands of different overlapping layers with confusing sets of responsibilities over things, and deeply aspirational titles for their organisations that don't really relate to what they actually do. There is a big issue trying to relate to NHS property services. Very often it's very remote from the place where they're actually trying to deal with. They're looking at capital funding. I mean, I can tell you this, the NHS has got one capital funding committee, for the entire structure. So my little local neighbourhood surgery that I want to replace with one to a higher standard, a larger size, has to go through the same committee as the one that's deciding on acute hospitals. You know, it is clearly not an efficient structure for taking those sorts of decisions, and there's no one empowered at a local enough level to really be able to see that through. So no, the NHS is not capable of tackling this because it's far too remote. What will be interesting to see is whether or not those city region areas, which are, or metro area areas, which have been given greater local accountability over the NHS, whether or not they are able to drive forward a much more proactive programme of trying to address issues with sustainability with those buildings. They're enormous buildings. They're largely built in very low energy cost times when this wasn't on the menu, and you know, you'd have thought there'd be significant savings they could make in the running costs, but that probably comes out of a totally different pot, and so it's not the problem with the person who's overseeing it.
Thanks a lot, Councillor. I see that the stars have aligned and our special guest is able to join us, which is great. And we'll come to her in a second. But before we do, Councillor Davey, in Cambridge Road Estate, were you interfacing with lots of different agencies, and were you finding different levels of receptiveness or resistance to what you were trying to achieve in terms of sustainability?
What we mainly focused on, because we had to have the tenants saying yes, because it's a voluntary ballot we put in. And we did face opposition, and so that our focus was on the tenants and all the residents, because all of the other housing associations that own properties on the estate. So it was on the residents and what they wanted and what they thought and what were their priorities. And then from that, then you get other agencies start taking an interest, you know. They're starting to think, oh wow, yeah, we could be using this, you know, we could be using this for health. Yeah, we'd be quite interested. Could we put some sort of health and well-being suite in there, do you think? And it's getting that, but if you start from what we were there, was starting from the residents, and what was in my mind of thinking of their entire life there, and thinking and talking with them of every aspect of their lives, of where do you go to let your children play? How do you, is there somewhere safe where they can play? What age are they? Are they able to play safely when they're older outside? So that's, we say lots of agencies weren't necessarily it's resident led. Now we're moving out of that, and we're moving into having it confirming. There's going to be a community board, and then there's the joint venture, because it's a joint venture partnership, that's separate. But the community board, again, it's resident led. And I think that actually, if you enable people to dream dreams, that's when actually we don't have to worry. It's talking about, oh, we have to read, educate, reteach. No. Actually release the potential of the residents themselves. Have faith in residents. Ask questions, ask them what they think, follow things through to logical conclusions, and you'll find actually it's not such a pessimistic world out there at all. Once you start asking people and listening to them, that actually a lot of the solutions are actually already with residents.
What a breath of fresh air and a ray of sunshine, given the circumstances of the last 3 months, Councillor Davey. Thank you for that. Jane, in Sutton, you mentioned the DFE. What this division between the sort of allowing residents to dream their dreams and having faith in their positivity and their wisdom and their aspirations, and institutions like DFE and NHS and so on not really responding to those and not giving you the ability to fulfil those aspirations. What can be done about that? What can the council do in particular?
That's a difficult one, because that is something that we've been pushing for. I mean, we've got our own planning policies, so obviously whatever's built in our borough, they have to adhere to those standards. And we have had quite a battle with the DFE actually on this, because it's the government delivering on projects that aren't up to the same standard as ours. We have been told we're going to have a new hospital built in our borough, and I very much hope that it's going to be to the standard. I think partnership working is the best thing we can do. I'm confident that our local NHS we've got good relationships with, and we set out our ambitions. We've been working for the London Council as well, which is the Institute of Cancer Research and the Royal Marsden, setting ambitions, and that's a really good example of where we worked in partnership